Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be starting our coverage of the 2017 U.S. Chess Championship. It's going to be going on for a few weeks. We have 12 competitors in St. Louis, Missouri. What's nice is 3 of the top 6 players in the world are in this tournament vying for the U.S. Chess Championship. Number 2 in the world right now is Wesley. So 3rd in the world is Fabiano Caruana, who won this event last year, trying to repeat. And in 6th place in the world is Nakamura. So we're in for a treat over the next few weeks. In round 1 today, we're going to be covering White's going to be played by Wesley. So he is currently the highest rated player in the United States. He's currently the 2nd highest rated player in the world, and there's no one been better at chess lately than Wesley. So if you haven't been following him much, in 2016, he won the Grand Chess Tour, partly because he won both the Singfield Cup and the London Classic. Just in 2017, one of the biggest tournaments of the year, the Tata Steel, he won that tournament, edging out Magnus Carlsen, the current world champion. So he is on fire. We're going to be watching him because he's actually playing the lowest rated player. This is Alexander Shabalov. He's 49 years old, so much older than 23 Wesley. So, but he's won the U.S. Championship 4 times before. His most recent one is in 2007, so it has been a little while, but he's very familiar with this tournament and knows what it takes to win. What's nice about him is he's kind of a wild card. He plays really creative, and he doesn't like to draw at all. And that's kind of the players that I like to cover. We're not going to be getting into the 17 move, draw and move on to the next game, or coming out the gates sluggish. This guy likes to come out with fireworks, and Wesley So, being the top-ranked player, definitely going to be a good match. So we'll go ahead and get into round 1 of the U.S. Chess Championships. So it starts out with pawn to c4, followed by pawn c6. And while initially it starts to look like the English opening, you can see it quickly transitions into the Queen's Gambit, and specifically the Slav defense with this pawn c6 and d5. Sometimes players will know that they're going to be getting into the Queen's Gambit lines, so they just kind of take a different approach to the starting instead of your normal pawn to d4, and then pawn c6, and then pawn c4, pawn d5. They chose to slightly change up the opening, but at the end of the day, this is getting into the Slav defense. And this is the pure Slav with the bishop coming outside this pawn chain. If you were to get into the semi-Slav, you would play pawn to e6. I personally prefer to get the light square bishop out. It does get a little tricky if you block it off with pawn to e6. More of a defensive way to go, not really the aggressive line I would expect from someone like Shabalov. So that's what we do see, the pure Slav. And then if you want to, there's a few ways to kind of attack this. You can play pawn to a6 early on. You're kind of expecting a pawn takes on d5, pawn recapture, and then you want to have a pawn here on a6 to still protect the square here on b5. But now that you do have the light square bishop outside the pawn chain, you can start to add a little pressure on your opponent. So those are some of the things to keep in mind in the pure Slav. Wesley So starts out with pawn to h3, kicking the bishop back here to f5, and the knight to c3, just developing his pieces like normal. E6, and now here's kind of where I thought we would see just the pawn take on d5. Nothing too crazy. That's fairly common on board. You see the pawn take, pawn recapture, maybe queen to b3 right now, trying to attack the center of the board, starting to add pressure on your opponent. You don't want them to play that pawn to a6 right away, since you are threatening queen takes on b7. So you could say queen to c7, and then bishop to e2, getting ready to castle on the king side. But Wesley So decides to go for something different. He says, first game, we're not going to be playing passive at all. Play pawn to g4, and this is an aggressive take. Usually when you're playing the Queen's Gambit, pushing up pawn to d4 and c4 usually means you're not going to be castling on the queen side because you just don't have a lot of protection for your king. Your pawns are pushed too forward. There's too much air in front of your king. But pawn to g4 says stuff's gonna happen in this game. I'm gonna play pretty aggressive here. So the bishop comes back to g6. It's worse if he were to come to e4. It just gets tricky. Then pawn pushes forward to g5, attacking the knight. Then if the bishop takes, queen recaptures. Now knight down here to e4. He could come back here to G8, but then that's just kind of ugly for black since he's just wasting his moves coming back to the 8th rank, and he has no pieces beyond the 8th rank right here. So knight to E4, and then after capture, pawn takes, queen takes here on E4. White is just completely dominating the board as far as material and tempo, and black's going to have a hard time getting back in this game. Wesley So I think will just kind of overwhelm his opponent. So in the game, decides to bring his bishop back here to G6 and the knight up here to E5. If you are going to be playing this pawn to G4, you have to continue to be aggressive in your game. Wesley So can't just stay back and then develop his pieces, bishop here to E2, and try to see what he wants to do with his king. He needs to continue to be as aggressive as possible. The bishop really can't go anywhere right now, so he knows his bishop's going to fall. He decides to go ahead and play knight to D7, start to add some other pieces onto his defense on the king side of the board, and also kind of make sure that this knight is going to do something. He can't just sit here all day because the knight is threatening the square here on E5. So decides to go ahead and take here on G6, takes back with his H-pawn. This does open up the door for a semi-open file for this rook here for H8. So this is another reason why we're probably not going to be seeing Wesley So castle on the king side, because he is very vulnerable for an attack with this rook here on H8. Wesley So now decides to just continue to push forward. Pawn here to G5, forcing the knight to move. And the knight has a couple options. He decides to go ahead and play knight back here to G8. If he wanted to, he could bring the knight down here to E4. Then we're just going to see capture. After this capture, pawn up here to H4. And I think all in all, White's going to have a better position. There's double pawns here on the G file. There's double pawns here on the E file. It's going to be difficult for black to really hold on to all this material in the center of the board. So I think this would be better off for white. So although I don't necessarily like black bringing his knight back here to G8 because it is somewhat of a wasted move, it's going to be more difficult to get this knight really involved into the action. I do think it is better than bringing it down here to E4. White continues with pawn to H4 and then knight to E7. The knight has to get back involved into the game. It can't come here to F6 or H6 because of this pawn nicely placed. So E7 is kind of an obvious move for black here. Then bishop here to D2. Not sure I expected to see bishop here to D2. I thought instead we might see pawn pushing forward to H5, just putting more pressure on his opponent. H5, the rook takes, maybe the rook takes here on H5, pawn recaptures, queen takes up here on H5. Starts to add more pressure on the king side of the board. Usually going to be seeing a black castle on the queen side, but then it's just kind of fireworks because Wesley So can just start to come behind enemy lines and start to add more pressure on his opponent. Pawn here to G6, and then the queen back here to G4. In the game, we decided to see somewhat of an interesting move. Bishop here to D2, making it look like he's going to start to castle on the king side or the queen side. Knight to F5, getting it involved into the action as we talked about. It's a nice little outpost move for this knight right here. And then queen up here to G4, just attacking this knight and also controlling the center of the board. Also does open up for this king to castle on the queen side. Now from here we see pawn to A6, and I'm not sure pawn A6 is the right way to think about this from black. Yes, you want to be playing pawn to A6 early in the Slav defense when you think there may be an exchange in the center, specifically on this D5 square. But that's not really what the game is about right now. You don't want to be playing too passive right now. This is sort of a defensive move, trying to see where your opponent's going to be going, making sure it doesn't bring his knight here to B5, making sure it doesn't bring his light square bishop over here to B5 after this pawn here on C4 is moved. But right now the game is about this king coming over here, castling on the queen side, and just throwing as much as you can on the queen side of the board. Not really looking at this pawn to A6, but that's what he decides to do. I think I would have preferred just playing bishop here to E7, just getting involved into the action. This does prevent your opponent from castling on the queen side because you could just now take with your bishop on G5. You can't recapture with this pawn because then the rook comes down, captures on H1, so that's bad. So it does stop them from doing what they want to do. I don't think A6 really stops Wesley So from doing what he wants to do. He does castle on the queen side as we talked about. Pawn captures here on c4, and then the bishop comes up here and takes on c4. And the next move is somewhat interesting as far as what black wants to do. He has a few different pieces he can get involved into the action. He can bring his bishop here to b4. He could bring his knight here to b6. This opens up some opportunities. It attacks the bishop right here. Also opens up the door for his queen to get involved into the action. He could bring his queen involved into the action. Could bring it queen here to c7. Does allow him to castle on the queen side. Does allow him to get his rook on this D file, semi-open file, to start to attack. I think he somewhat needs to have some of these pawns in front. He has so much pressure on the king side of the board. And usually when your opponent castles on the queen side, like Wesley so does, he can just throw the kitchen sink on the king side. So black is not going to be looking to castle on the king side too much. He doesn't have a great defense here with no pawn on the h file. And then knowing that Wesley so can just start pushing up the board. He already has his queen and his rook over here. He's going to be looking on the queen side. I was interested to see this next move because he didn't really do any of those that we talked about. I thought the best move right here would be knight to b6 because it does attack and opens up the door for the queen. Anytime some of your normal moves do a couple things on board, I really like that approach. Even just getting your dark square bishop involved, more aggressive on the queen side of the board, I think makes sense. He decided to go and play pawn to c5, which kind of blows up the center of the board. It's not necessarily a bad move, but it's a very risky move because after the pawn takes, the bishop takes, this is a good square for this bishop, but all of a sudden we start to see some open files on the queen side of the board. There's no longer a safe passage for the black king. We already talked about it's not going to be looking to castle on the king side. I think it's now risky to castle on the queen side. And so this is where we start to see a little bit of black being that risky player, knowing that he's up against someone much stronger than him. So he's just going to put Wesley So in some really tough decisions and say, hey, do you have the chops here? Because I'm going to be as aggressive as I possibly can and just see if you can make a mistake. White continues with bishop back here to e2. And then the bishop comes back here to e7, kind of opening up the door for these long files to start to be taken advantage of by some of the stronger pieces on board. So decides to bring his king over here to b1, wants to make sure that his king is not in line for a strong attack with the rook coming over here to c8, wants to have it protected behind some of these pawns right here. I snap expected black to not even think about this too much, to play rook over here to c8. Hopefully a lot of you look at this and recognize that rook to c8 makes a lot of sense. You want to get your rooks involved into the action. If they can control an open file, that's where they belong, especially if that's where your opponent's king is situated. I think he has some really strong attacks if he plays rook here to c8. That's not what he decided to do. Instead, he decides to play rook here to b6. Not sure that's what the game is about. And then we see knight to a4. I like the aggressive play from Wesley So, always putting his opponent in a position where he's kind of forced to move and play defenses instead of coming up with a more aggressive line like I know black wants to be doing in this position. Also think pawn to e4 would have been fine as well. Brings the knight back here to d6. And then bishop e3, just more centralizing the bishop, attacking the queen right here. But all in all, I still like his approach with knight to a4. Now the queen comes back here to c7, rook here to c1, and then queen down here to d6. But you can see how different this is for white. White now controls this c file right here, and then all of a sudden this rook on a8 doesn't look that great anymore. Can't really bring it to c8 right now. It would fall, and so it just kind of sits there and just kind of wonders what's going to be happening from Wesley. So bishop here to a5. So you can see starting to put a lot of pressure on his opponent. Doesn't have many great moves. I still think it's very dangerous for him to castle on the king side. But he's just kind of taking away any of the squares on the queen side of the board. So his king's somewhat trapped in the center of the board. Definitely not what you want to be doing in a chess game. Knight here to e5, queen over here to e4, putting more pressure, attacking this pawn here on b7. Knight up here to c6. I think this somewhat misses the boat. It is trying to stop a lot of the pressure on board, but really just playing too defensive in my opinion. Rook over here to d1, attacking the queen. Queen is forced to move, or have this in between move. Rook down here to h4, attacking the queen, but then pawn to f4 pretty much puts a stop to that. Not only does it put a stop to it, solidifies this pawn chain, but it now completely takes away any potential to castle on the king side, swing the rook over and get involved on the queen side of the board. This rook on h4 is now completely away from any of the action that's going on, while Wesley, so if you look at it, he has all of his material kind of cohesively working together on the queen side of the board. Queen back here to b8. This is another one of those where I just don't necessarily like my queen coming back here to b8. If you're in this position on the board, we're in move 24, and your rook is on a8 and your queen is on b8, this is not the position you want to be in. This kind of is the surrender cobra in a sports arena, where you just kind of look at it and be like, yeah, you've somewhat given up. You're just kind of trying to hold on as much as possible, but things are not looking good. Wesley so recognizes this, and he starts to just be more aggressive. Knight here to b6, attacking the rook. You almost expect the rook has to come here to a7. It is trapped right now. There's really nowhere else to go, but he doesn't. He plays knight to d6, attacking the queen, but it just doesn't do enough. The queen can now come here to a4, and things just get really, really difficult. It does now pin down the knight to the king, and so there's just no longer any great moves. Rook to a7 now, but you can see Black's just playing completely defensive. Neither of his rooks are doing anything on board. We always talk about what material is involved in the action. Black doesn't really have any material. These knights are just kind of blocking some of the attacks off, but they're not doing anything productive. Bishop here to f3, starting to add more attacks on this central square here on c6 in the center of the board. Knight to b5, trying to block off some of the attack because he does have this outpost from the pawn here on a6. But then queen down here, c3, making sure he still can attack the square here on c6. Queen to c7. There's just not a lot of moves for this queen to come to. He can't come to d6. It would fall from the rook. Can't come here to e5 because the pawn. There's just no great squares. And both a8 and c8 are both being attacked by the knight here on b6. But after the rook comes here to c7, then you have knight to d7, and Black is forced to resign. There's just no great squares for Black to go to right now. Many times people ask, well, how would this continue on board? So we can look at a few examples of what it might look like. Let's say the queen came back here to b8, one of the few safe moves for the queen. Then all of a sudden, bishop takes here on c6. There is going to be a discovered attack after the rook moves here. So maybe the king moves, then the bishop takes back here on b5. All in all, the pieces just start to crumble. Nothing good is going on in this position. If we could come back and say, well, what if the queen just takes here on d7? Well, then the queen's going to fall. That's sort of the obvious one. Bishop down here, d6. Knight to e5, nice little outpost, but just kind of just sets it up for bad things to happen. Bishop takes here on c6, pawn recaptures, queen up here to c6. If instead we come back and then the king comes to f8, well, same thing, the queen is going to fall right here. So all in all, there's not much that Black can do here. He recognizes that he kind of dug himself in a hole. All of his pieces are just kind of congested right here, and Wesley So is just going to start picking them off. So decides to go ahead and resign. Love the fact that he gave a great effort. He played the most aggressive lines you could in most of the positions. I think a few different places he could have definitely played better. But all in all, Wesley So came out the gates with that pawn to g4, played extremely aggressive and said, hey, I cannot come away from this game playing the lowest rated player at this tournament and not come away with a win with the white pieces. And he does what he's been doing for the last year, and he just kind of took advantage and won the game. So congratulations to him, the hottest player coming into the tournament, definitely the favorite right now in the field. So all in all, great round one. Usually in these tournaments, we see some sluggish starts, some draws for the first few rounds. We try to figure out wins are going to be some exciting chess. We got one in round 1. So hopefully you guys are excited about this tournament. Got a few weeks of great chess. But thanks for watching. I'll see you in round 2.